At the G20 summit held from November 21 to 23, an important speech by Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, was removed from the official program. According to leaked information, Traoré stepped forward before the world's most powerful leaders and delivered a message that left the entire hall in stunned silence. This speech was not just an ordinary diplomatic statement, but a direct challenge to international decisions that have long overlooked Africa. In his speech, Traoré directly targeted South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, emphasizing that Africa can no longer endure poverty, crushing debt, and political instability while outside powers continue to benefit. To fully understand Traoré's powerful message and its historical significance, hit like and join us as we explore the details of this speech. At the Johannesburg G20 summit, Ibrahim Traoré did not mince words. Standing before the world's leaders, he presented a detailed critique of President Cyril Ramaphosa's actions, 10 points that collectively portrayed a pattern of decisions favoring Western powers at the expense of African nations. His accusations were precise and firm, reflecting not just personal conviction, but a broader concern for Burkina Faso and the continent as a whole. First, Traoré denounced Ramaphosa's excessive concessions to the European Union. According to him, trade agreements were being signed that benefited European economies while undermining local industries in countries like Burkina Faso, Zambia, and Nigeria. These policies, he argued, jeopardized decades of economic development and threatened the livelihoods of ordinary citizens. Second, he criticized the neglect of African debt. While Ramaphosa had pledged to represent the interests of the global South, Traoré insisted that he had failed to push for meaningful debt relief for the continent's poorest nations. Third, the young leader addressed climate policy. He accused Ramaphosa of yielding to Western pressure to reduce coal production without offering viable energy transition support for African nations dependent on fossil fuels. Fourth and fifth, Traoré raised concerns about unilateral decision-making and resource exploitation. He claimed Ramaphosa bypassed coordination with African Union partners, stalling internal cooperation, and allowed European companies to extract minerals without ensuring fair profit sharing, leaving lasting economic damage. Additional points targeted Africa's military autonomy, trade compromises at the G20, insufficient action against cross-border corruption, political division within Africa, and inadequate support for democratic movements. Each accusation was backed by examples of countries affected or policies in question, highlighting the stakes for the continent. Traoré concluded this section with a stark warning. Africa's leaders must choose stand with the people of Africa or continue concessions that weaken the continent's position globally. The hall's silence reflected the gravity of the moment, while social media buzzed with reactions from young Africans tracking every word. But that was just the beginning. The implications of Traoré's message stretched far beyond the G20 halls, signaling a potential shift in both regional and global power dynamics. The tension in the G20 hall was palpable as Ibrahim Traoré spoke. Every word landed with precision, his gaze fixed on Cyril Ramaphosa, conveying not anger for its own sake, but an unwavering demand for accountability. Traoré's delivery elevated the moment beyond standard diplomacy. It was a performance of conviction, illustrating the stakes not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire African continent. Delegates leaned forward, aware that this young leader was redefining the expectations of African representation on the global stage. Traoré's criticism of trade agreements with Europe and the neglect of African debt relief resonated deeply with several African delegates. Countries like Burkina Faso, Zambia, and Nigeria were spotlighted as examples of the tangible consequences of policies favoring Western powers. He emphasized that these decisions undermined local industries, slowed economic growth, and perpetuated systemic inequities. The youth and civil society observers in the hall were visibly moved, recognizing in Traoré a voice that refused to remain silent against structural imbalances. Beyond the immediate audience, the speech reverberated through African news outlets, triggering extensive coverage and debate. Analysts highlighted how Traoré's stance exposed a growing rift between African leaders who prioritize global alliances and those advocating for a more assertive, independent approach. His call for collective African action, coordination with the African Union, and equitable management of natural resources struck a chord with audiences across West and Central Africa. The hall's silence, punctuated only by the careful scribbling of notes and whispered consultations among senior diplomats, underscored the shock of the moment. The young leader's critique was not mere rhetoric. It was a direct challenge to entrenched practices and a demand for tangible accountability. Traoré framed every accusation with concrete examples: coal-dependent energy policies, mineral exploitation, and cross-border corruption, making it impossible to dismiss his words as abstract idealism. Even as the session concluded, murmurs and exchanges revealed the weight of his message. Ramaphosa, for the first time, appeared reflective rather than defensive, signaling that Traoré's words had struck deeper than anticipated. Yet the story extended far beyond the summit room. The reactions, both politically and socially, were about to unfold across Africa and around the world, shaping the narrative for months to come. The impact of Ibrahim Traoré's speech quickly extended beyond the G20 summit hall. Across Africa, particularly in West and Central regions, African news outlets carried his statements in real time, highlighting his bold stance against concessions to Western powers. Social media buzzed with clips and analyses, especially among young leaders and activists who saw in Traoré a rare embodiment of courage and principled leadership. The narrative was clear. A new generation of African leaders was emerging, unafraid to hold even their continental peers accountable. Internationally, analysts from Europe and the United States observed the unfolding situation with keen interest. Many noted that Traoré's direct confrontation with Ramaphosa was unprecedented for a leader so young, emphasizing Burkina Faso's growing voice in regional diplomacy. The speech illuminated tensions within the G20 regarding Africa's role in global trade, debt negotiations, and climate policy. Traoré's insistence on fair treatment, sustainable development, and coordinated African action challenged the existing global hierarchy, signaling that smaller nations could now assert influence on the world stage. Within the summit hall, reactions varied. Some African leaders nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth in Traoré's words, while others exchanged cautious glances, weighing the diplomatic consequences. Ramaphosa himself appeared contemplative, signaling that the critique might influence future policy stances. The moment crystallized a broader issue. Africa's collective voice had long been fragmented, and Traoré's assertiveness highlighted both the possibility and necessity of unity. The youth of Burkina Faso and neighboring countries responded enthusiastically, interpreting Traoré's 10-point message as a call to action. Civil society organizations began discussing new strategies for regional cooperation, fair resource distribution, and enhanced transparency. The speech also sparked debates in think tanks across Washington and Brussels, with policy experts analyzing how Traoré's firm stance could recalibrate Africa-West relations in trade, climate, and security. By the end of the day, the G20 narrative had shifted. No longer could African perspectives be treated as secondary. Ibrahim Traoré had ensured that Burkina Faso and Africa were heard loud and clear. The hall remained in thoughtful silence as the consequences of this pivotal moment began to take shape, setting the stage for changes that could redefine political and economic dynamics across the continent. Yet even as discussions continued, the real ramifications for civil society, governance, and international diplomacy were only beginning to unfold, leading us to the next phase of Traoré's historic influence. The reverberations of Ibrahim Traoré's decisive address at the G20 summit were immediately felt within Burkina Faso and across West Africa. Civil society groups hailed his courage, interpreting his speech as a pivotal moment for regional empowerment. Young leaders, activists, and students found renewed inspiration, seeing in Traoré a figure willing to challenge not only Western powers, but also entrenched African political hierarchies. Discussions erupted in universities, NGOs, and local media about the need for stronger continental solidarity, equitable economic policies, and transparent governance. Traoré's emphasis on fair trade and resource management directly highlighted the economic vulnerabilities of nations like Burkina Faso. Industries previously stifled by international trade agreements began to re-evaluate strategies, considering ways to prioritize local production and innovation. Citizens, often frustrated by historical neglect in global decision-making, felt a newfound agency, energized by the prospect of their voices being amplified through leadership that genuinely represented African interests. Politically, Traoré's speech prompted urgent consultations among regional leaders. Governments in neighboring West and Central African countries began reassessing diplomatic approaches, particularly regarding trade agreements, debt negotiations, and energy policies. His insistence on coordination with the African Union and resistance to unilateral concessions provided a blueprint for collective regional strategy, reinforcing the principle that African nations could negotiate as equals on the global stage. The speech also sparked debates within the political elite. Some leaders, cautious of upsetting delicate international relationships, weighed the potential consequences of Traoré's assertiveness. Others recognized the necessity of this bold stance, understanding that maintaining the status quo only perpetuated Africa's marginalization in global forums. The tension underscored a central theme: leadership that genuinely prioritizes the welfare of African citizens often requires confronting uncomfortable truths about entrenched power structures. Yet, while the immediate reactions were encouraging, the real test of Traoré's influence lay in how these political shifts would translate into tangible improvements for the people of Burkina Faso and the wider continent. Beyond the political corridors, the ramifications of Traoré's message quickly reached everyday citizens. In Burkina Faso, communities debated the implications of his speech on local governance, economic opportunity, and social justice. The emphasis on fair trade and resource sovereignty sparked civic engagement, with citizens demanding greater accountability from both national and regional leaders. Grassroots organizations began initiatives aimed at monitoring public spending, promoting transparency in extractive industries, and supporting local entrepreneurs. Across West and Central Africa, youth movements found in Traoré a symbol of possibility. Students, young professionals, and activists discussed how his decisive stance could reshape the continent's trajectory, from trade independence to political self-determination. Africa news platforms highlighted these movements, noting a surge in discussions around national reform, civic responsibility, and the role of regional unity in achieving sustainable development. Politically, the speech catalyzed a reassessment among African leaders. Governments began more seriously considering the impacts of trade deals, debt agreements, and energy transitions. The call for coordination through the African Union inspired initiatives to strengthen regional institutions, ensuring that decisions would reflect the interests of multiple nations rather than a select few. This shift suggested a gradual but significant change in how Africa approached negotiations with Western powers and multinational corporations. Moreover, international observers, including analysts from the United States and Europe, recognized the speech as a turning point. Traoré's insistence on African self-determination and equitable economic practices signaled that leaders of smaller nations could assert influence and demand respect on the global stage. The broader implication was clear. Africa, guided by leaders like Traoré, could challenge traditional power dynamics while fostering a new era of political responsibility and citizen empowerment. As these societal and political currents began to take shape, the stage was set for Traoré's influence to extend further, heralding a moment where the continent's collective voice could alter not only regional but global narratives. From a global perspective, Ibrahim Traoré's assertive address at the G20 captured significant attention in both Washington and Brussels. Analysts in the United States viewed the young leader's stance as a clear signal that African nations were increasingly willing to challenge established Western-dominated trade and diplomatic norms. Traoré's insistence on fair trade, debt relief, and energy sovereignty highlighted a growing awareness among smaller nations that their economic and political interests cannot be subordinated to external agendas. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, emerged as a focal point in these discussions. The country's emphasis on protecting local industries and advocating for equitable resource distribution became emblematic of a broader movement among West African nations seeking to assert influence within international forums. Africa News reported on these developments extensively, noting that Traoré's critique was more than a symbolic gesture. It reflected substantive policy priorities with potential long-term consequences for global trade relations. U.S. policymakers interpreted Traoré's message as a nuanced challenge. While African nations are eager to engage with global markets, they demand recognition as equal partners. Trade agreements that once allowed Western nations to dominate resources or dictate terms were now under scrutiny. Traoré's call for African unity and strategic negotiation underscored a new era where leaders from Burkina Faso and its neighbors could leverage collective bargaining power to reshape economic partnerships. The European Union, similarly, monitored the unfolding events with interest. Traoré's direct confrontation with Ramaphosa underscored a critical point. Regional leadership matters, and assertive voices from Africa could alter long-standing diplomatic assumptions. Observers recognized that the speech had positioned Burkina Faso and its leader as a rising influence in shaping policies that affect the continent's economic and political future. Yet while Western analysts considered these implications, the broader reactions from global media and diplomatic circles were only beginning to reveal the full weight of Traoré's challenge. Across international media, Ibrahim Traoré's speech was hailed as a defining moment for Africa's role in global affairs. African news outlets emphasized how his uncompromising stance highlighted the continent's demand for respect, fairness, and self-determination. Traoré's insistence that African nations should not be secondary players in decisions affecting trade, climate, and security resonated strongly with audiences both within and beyond the continent. In Washington, policymakers debated the potential implications. Traoré's challenge to Ramaphosa, and by extension to established Western strategies, signaled a shift in Africa's diplomatic posture. Analysts noted that Burkina Faso's growing influence could inspire other nations to adopt similar assertive approaches, effectively recalibrating the balance of power in future G20 negotiations. Traoré's emphasis on African unity, fair resource distribution, and coordinated regional policy suggested that the continent could collectively wield leverage previously underestimated by Western powers. European observers reached similar conclusions. Traoré's speech underscored the necessity for Brussels and other capitals to rethink engagement strategies. Economic agreements and aid policies would need to account for the demands of African leadership that is increasingly informed, vocal, and unafraid to contest conventional norms. The speech elevated Burkina Faso from a regional actor to a symbol of proactive, principled leadership, a nation willing to hold peers accountable while advocating for equitable policies on a global stage. Social media and civil society organizations worldwide amplified Traoré's message. Young Africans, in particular, interpreted his words as validation of their frustrations with systemic inequalities, while international audiences recognized the broader implications for diplomacy, trade, and development. The unfolding narrative signaled a new era. African nations, led by figures like Traoré, were not merely participants in global discourse, they were shaping it. As these global and regional dynamics evolved, the stage was set for an unexpected shift in the balance of power, one that would elevate Traoré's influence and redefine Africa's position in the world, leading directly into the pivotal twist of his rising prominence. In the weeks following the G20 summit, the repercussions of Ibrahim Traoré's bold stance began to manifest in unexpected ways. Leaders from West and Central Africa, inspired by his assertiveness, convened emergency meetings to reassess regional strategies. Burkina Faso's influence, once considered limited on the global stage, expanded rapidly. Through careful diplomacy and decisive messaging, Traoré established himself as a central figure in guiding Africa's collective approach to international trade, climate policy, and debt negotiations. The pivot was both symbolic and strategic. Traoré's insistence on fair resource management and equitable economic partnerships resonated with smaller nations that had long felt marginalized in G20 deliberations. By aligning regional interests and promoting unified demands, he effectively shifted the dynamics of negotiations, ensuring that African voices could no longer be sidelined. Analysts from the United States and Europe noted the significance. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, was setting a precedent for proactive, principled leadership, signaling to the global community that Africa was ready to assert its collective power. Civil society organizations across the continent amplified this momentum. Youth movements, local NGOs, and economic forums rallied around the principles Traoré had articulated, advocating for transparency, accountability, and regional cooperation. The speech had ignited more than conversation, it had catalyzed action, creating a tangible ripple effect that strengthened both political cohesion and public engagement throughout the continent. Yet, this was only the first wave of Traoré's influence. The true culmination of his strategic and symbolic power was about to reshape Africa's international standing entirely. The second wave of Traoré's influence was even more striking. As African nations observed Burkina Faso's rise in diplomatic weight, alliances began to shift. Countries across West and Central Africa publicly endorsed Traoré's approach, emphasizing unity, strategic negotiation, and regional self-determination. This endorsement elevated him from a national leader to a continental symbol, a figure representing the aspirations of an entire generation determined to reclaim Africa's voice in global affairs. Economically, the ripple effects were immediate. Collaborative projects that had stalled for years gained new momentum, with equitable frameworks for trade, resource sharing, and infrastructure development emerging across borders. Traoré's insistence on fair deals and transparent governance ensured that these initiatives directly benefited local communities, empowering citizens and reinforcing trust in regional leadership. Internationally, the message was clear. Africa, led by decisive and principled leaders like Traoré, would no longer be a passive participant in global forums. Observers in Washington, Brussels, and beyond recognized that the continent was entering a new era, one where smaller nations could negotiate on equal footing and assert influence over policies affecting their futures. For the people of Burkina Faso, this shift was tangible. Civic engagement increased, youth movements flourished, and citizens felt a renewed sense of agency. Traoré had transformed a single speech into a catalyst for a broader transformation, demonstrating that courage, vision, and strategic action could alter the balance of power and redefine Africa's role in the world. With this unexpected turn, Ibrahim Traoré had not only challenged the status quo, he had begun shaping the very trajectory of the continent, setting the stage for a new chapter of empowerment, independence, and hope. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is more than a single speech at the G20 summit. It is a testament to the power of principled leadership. Under his guidance, Burkina Faso and neighboring nations began to witness tangible changes. Renewed civic engagement, stronger regional cooperation, and an economic framework that prioritizes fairness and local empowerment. Citizens now see that their voices matter, and that leadership rooted in courage and accountability can transform societies. Traoré's words continue to resonate. We do not ask permission to be free. We have risen to claim it. This declaration embodies the spirit of a continent refusing to bow to external pressures, asserting its rights and reclaiming its destiny. For observers around the world, the message is clear. Africa, led by visionary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, is charting a new course, one that demands respect, promotes equity, and inspires the next generation to engage actively in shaping their nations. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to continue following the journey of a continent no longer willing to yield. Let the world witness Africa's awakening. God bless Africa.